one artist is going to be also, we're going to be discussing today. It is Janina Kraupe-Swiderska, artist from the same generation as Galina Konopatska, but based in Poland. And then there are 3 contemporary artists in the exhibition: Bonnie Kamplin, Annie Goh, Jackie Caruti, and Alexandra Paperno. But today we're going to concentrate mainly on Galina Konopatska, the Cosmic Mother artwork, and Janina Kraupe-Swiderska. I would like you to see So I was just hearing really strong echo. Sorry, now it's gone. If we could just show the image of the of the way the Cosmic Mother is installed in the space now. So it's actually shown as a projection rather than a real artwork, because we couldn't get the original artwork and we couldn't ship it because it's in Dagestan, which is south of Russia. So we decided to show it as a sort of an apparition. So, and there is this kind of idea also of an accessibility, because there is this big floor work by Alexandra Paperno, and people can observe kind of the apparition of this Cosmic Mother from far away. Yeah, I think that's it about Cosmic Mothers and the Cosmic Mother. And I'm just gonna, for those who are joining us for the first time in this like virtual space, just a couple of words about Mimosa House. So Mimosa House is a non-profit institution, and we support female and queer artists and practitioners. So I'm gonna now invite PPV, Perverted Power Vertical, to introduce themselves and to introduce Dina.
Hi everyone, and Daria, thank you so much for the introduction and also for this exciting collaboration. We're really thrilled to be back in Mimosa House virtual space. And I'm speaking on behalf of Denis and Michał here, just to say that we represent PPV, which is Perverting the Power Vertical, which is a restless nomadic seminar series that we founded in 2018. This is our 25th event.
Quarter-life crisis.
And quarter-life crisis. And it is both nomadic, so it kind of moves around London, but also Venice. We've done an exhibition online as well. But we're also rooted and based at SEAS, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL, and supported by various institutions at UCLs and further fields. So I'm going to now pass over to Michał.
Thank you, Masha. That was really nice. And thanks, Daria, for hosting us. And thanks so much also to Eva and Madina and Dina for joining us today. It's wonderful that we can make this happen so quickly and so auspiciously. So I'm going to just introduce Dina Akhmadeeva, who's the chair of today's discussion and who's been working with Eva and Madina to kind of isolate the main themes of the conversation. Dina is a London-based art historian, curator, and writer. She's institutionally based at Tate Modern, where she is assistant curator of international art. And she also works on acquisitions in the collection with a focus on Central and Eastern Europe. But Dina also does an extraordinary, rich array of independent projects, including in 2018, the Baltic Triennial 13, which happened in Vilnius, Tallinn, and Riga, the exhibition Avoidance, which is at Futura in Prague in 2021. And just now, Dina's curated a sound program called In the Mouths of Others as part of the exhibition Eurasia, a Landscape of Mutability at MHKA, Museum of Contemporary Art, Antwerp. And I've been listening to the outputs of In the Mouths of Others on Spotify, where they are available, and I thoroughly recommend them to everyone. So Dina, over to you.
Thanks, Michał. And thank you, of course, Daria, Sandra, Divya, Michał again, Masha, and Denis. So I'm really honored to introduce two absolutely brilliant thinkers to help unpack some of the strands that the work of Galina Konopatska and Nina Krapa-Swiderska bring out as they relate to Madina's and Eva's own research and practice. So Madina Tlostanova is a decolonial thinker and theorist working at the intersection of the decolonial and desovietizing, bringing much needed discussions on what she terms the darker colonial side of Soviet modernization to the fore. She's based in Sweden, where she's professor of postcolonial feminisms at Linköping University. And she's published prolifically, and I'm going to name just a couple of recent books that she's published, including What Does It Mean to Be Post-Soviet? Decolonial Art from the Ruins of the Soviet Empire in 2018, and Decoloniality of Knowledge, Being and Sensing in 2020. She's likewise a writer of fiction, and she's working on an experimental book currently titled Fictions of Unsettlement. And Madina will speak on the work of Galina Konopatska. And Eva Majewska is a feminist philosopher, theorist, and activist who has been affiliated with the University of Warsaw and the Jagiellonian University in Krakow in Poland. And she has likewise been a visiting scholar at the University of California in Berkeley, the Institute of Cultural Inquiry in Berlin. She's currently based in Warsaw and also lectures at the UDK in Berlin. Her work brilliantly engages with the feminist politics of anti-fascism. Her most recent publication is the English language book Feminist Anti-Fascism, Counterpublics of the Common, published in 2021, where she also elaborates on one of the key ideas of weak resistance that I hope will be very pertinent to our discussion today, and also looks at the political mobilization originating in Poland, both some 40 years ago and in the last 5 to 6 years. There are 4 book-length publications in Polish for those lucky enough to read the language, but also numerous brilliant articles across spaces such as eFlux and Third Text. So Eva will speak to and through with the work of Nina Krapa-Swiderska. Eva and Madina will speak for about 10 minutes each before discussion, and we encourage you to also put questions in the chat that we will pick up a little bit later. So I think we'll start with Eva.
Thank you so very much for the invitation to this amazing panel, for the opportunity to also speak about communism and weak resistance, which I always enjoy. But also thank you for the big presence of the audience with us in the Zoom setting. I very much regret I couldn't come to the show and see the show, because it seems super exciting and fantastically on time, I would say. I was thinking just before this panel about those efforts of most famous, but also the richest businessmen in the world to conquer cosmos, and somehow your exhibition exposing all kinds of vulnerabilities and peripheralities somehow very nicely contradicts with the image of Elon Musk and his skyrocket, which had the shape of you know what, and sort of conquered the sky in a very different way. So I'm very honored to be a part of a discussion about cosmos from a feminist multicultural decolonial perspective. I think it's an amazing inspiration. When we think about cosmos, all those conquering images come to head. I think the first association most people have with the cosmos, and I had many occasions to check it out with different generations, different professions of interlocutors, most people associate cosmos with the space. So there is this already kind of conquering image of out there being cosmos, and here being something else than cosmos. So the Greek origin of the word cosmos is actually as synonymic to what we understand as universe. So it's basically what is here and what is back there. And I believe that this exhibition also very nicely plays on this intersectionality, hybridity, complicatedness of the cosmic, and this complicatedness includes the inside and the outside. So although the exhibition does not have a dialectical character par excellence, I tend to see it in sort of dialectical way, especially the images that, if you want to start the presentation, this would be maybe a good time. So basically the images of Janina Kraupe-Świderska, which go deeply into the sort of introvert world, inner world of the spiritual knowledge, etc., and the images of what we typically understand as cosmos, images coming from Galina Konopatskaya, depicting the explorations of the cosmic, but still with this motherhood, motherly figure, which is usually associated with the inside. So we have multiple plays of inside and outside knowledge, inside and outside presence, inside and outside universes that sort of haunt us around. Maybe if we stay with the images of Janina Kraupe-Świderska would be nice for a moment. So I was invited to this talk and I was thinking very much about the colonial because of Madina and her work on the coloniality. But I was also thinking of what does it actually mean to discuss, to think about the colonial from the perspective of what used to be called, until quite recently, Second World. And since a while, I've been trying to examine what we actually mean by the Second World. Where is it? What happened to it? And I mean, if I could request a change of image to Janina Kraupe-Świderska, it would be super nice, because what we now see is not Janina Kraupe-Świderska, I think so. Anyhow, what we mean by the Second World is actually something that is missing from the global map of decolonial conversation, which very correctly in many senses of the word undermines the First World and Third World inequalities, conflicts, differences, oppressions, etc., etc. The Second World, for many years, signalized the semi-peripheral. This is how I understand it. So we can look into the older work of Immanuel Wallerstein for more specific definitions of it. But I would say that semi-periphery is something that is always in between. And this concept of in-betweeners is useful to understand the works of Janina Kraupe-Świderska, to understand the works of other artists that are exhibited here. And this in-betweeners means that on one hand, we are sort of haunted to become the First World. So there is this temptation of becoming central, of becoming most powerful, of becoming into the focus of global epistemology, global business, global politics, anything we want. But then this semi-peripheral in-betweeners means that you want to escape by all means from what is peripheral. So there is this tendency of running away and also of being different from what is perceived as this maybe third world in the old-fashioned categories, or peripheral according to the categories of Wallerstein. And this position of in-betweeners means that in many ways, as Wallerstein was discussing, the semi-peripheral countries practice this kind of ultra-competitive strategy between each other. So this tendency of competing for this place, the closest to the center kind of position, makes it very difficult for the semi-peripheral countries to meet among themselves on this egalitarian platform. It's rather running away from each other and trying to get to the core countries and to the central countries that we, meaning Poland, meaning former East European countries, meaning also South American countries, South Africa and other also called developing countries practice. So in the art of the artists and also of women and feminist artists from Eastern Europe, you don't see this competitiveness, but you do see a certain, I would say, valorization of the weakness. And I believe that the choices that Janina Kraupe was making throughout her life, the choices to go with the metaphysical, but metaphysical not understood as the powerful, medieval theologian metaphysical. No, this is not the metaphysics of power, I would say. These are metaphysics, they are various, and they come from knowledges which I would call secondary knowledges or excluded knowledges or marginalized knowledges. So basically knowledges that have had to make space for the knowledge, the Eurocentric, enlightened knowledge to come. So they were marginalized. So it would be horoscope, it would be tarot and Kabbalah, it would be all kinds of minoritarian traditions. And in the work of Janina Kraupe-Świderska, they are all employed to depict not only the spiritual richness of this kind of meditative state and meditative analysis of cosmos, but they are also used to create abstract paintings and abstract images. And this is something that is very atypical, because usually, as we know from history of art, it would be geometrical signs, it would be maybe fragments of landscapes, it would be industrial references that would sit in the core of the classical avant-garde art. And yet here we have this strong imposition, I would say, of metaphysical references, replacing those typical avant-garde styles. So for that reason, I would like to make a reference to Boris Groys and his analysis of the weak universalism, where he depicts the avant-garde not as a macho, strong, empowered discourse of art, but he speaks of the avant-garde as of a formation, or some formations, because he depicts the Russian avant-garde of early 20th century. He speaks of Joseph Beuys back in the 60s and 70s. So there are different currents, different strands of avant-garde that he depicts. And he speaks of those avant-gardes as trying to find universality in the simplest references, in the references to geometry, to industry, so references that are popular and understandable for everyone. So therefore, there is a sort of resignation from complicatedness, complexity. There is a resignation from power position in an effort to reach out for the widest publics. And I believe that there is something like that in Janina Kraupe-Świderska's work. However, what I see also in her work is a kind of resignation from power on the level of the sensual, the colorful, the perhaps childish or naive. So there is a certain effort to be to build the universality with the means and tools that can be really understandable, comprehensible by many. And as we were invited to discuss the communism and evolution from post-socialism to communism, I would like to mention one more thing, which maybe is interesting in the context of the work of Janina Kraupe-Świderska, but also in the context of this exhibition and our discussion, which is the sort of commonality of the common. There is the general understanding of the word common, which follows post-Spinozan Marxist thought. So basically, Toni Negri, Michael Hart, and the common as alternative to private and public alike. So common understood as maybe collectively owned or a lived experience of a collective, etc., etc. This is one understanding of the common, but there is another one, which is basically rooted in the sense of simplicity, ordinarity. So the common, understood as in the idiom common folk, for instance, or common language, is another layer of how we should understand the common and communism by that. So therefore, even with the ultra sophisticated knowledge that Kraupe-Świderska possessed, when she applies her colorful metaphysical, mystical work into art, she seems to be reaching out to a super large audience precisely because she follows the traces of naivete, of childish sort of references, of horoscope, why not, which is super popular in Europe and in Poland. Some 30% of people actually read horoscopes, so it's quite a popular knowledge, in fact. And most people have some references to zodiac signs and colors and dimensions, etc. There is also, for for this exhibition, there is also this context of Cosmos being addressed by a woman artist, so already somebody who is slightly in a weaker power position than a male artist from Eastern Europe, so again, semi-peripheral, kind of not so powerful territory. So addressing the cosmos from such marginal perspective, which is not only marginal in one aspect, but which is a kind of hybridity of margins, it seems like a paradox. It seems like a contradictory practice, because it's in the classical, in the popular understanding of cosmos, we sort of conquer cosmos, and here we have the attitude of kind of opening up to cosmos, letting the cosmos in. Basically, the images that you can see on the screen might be understood as references to internal spiritual experience, so basically the opposite trajectory. But also I'm thinking of Janina Kraupe-Świderska and other artists exhibited in this show as those who practice weak avant-garde and weak resistance rather than the powerful, strong one. So basically they opt for strategies of the marginalized and peripheralized very consciously. They choose references to those knowledges and artistic practices that have been expelled or pulled away. And with those strategies, they try to address the universal. And therefore, they sort of build a weak version of universality without those power, those claims to power that usually accompany any form of building of universality. So I'm going to stop at that point, and I hope I didn't go into too many contexts and too many digressions. And I would like to pass the word to Madina now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so I will also try to be as short as possible. I must say that the title of this quite interesting exhibition, and again, I have to say also, as Eva did, that I would love to be there and be able to see it, but unfortunately we're all stuck again. So when I heard from Daria what is the title and what is the conception of this exhibition, and also of Galina Kanapatska's painting, has first triggered my first reactions. I mean, that were triggered were quite unexpected in points of their associations, and they were far from the topic of our discussion maybe, but I still will mention it because it refers more to a feminist trajectory. I mean, Monica Hugh and Barbara Moore's quite well-known and very controversial book, which was published in 1987, although it was written a little bit before, and it's called The Great Cosmic Mother. And the book was quite well known and quite kind of heatedly discussed, and very instrumental in launching the so-called goddess movement, and generally contributed to the anarchist and early environmental feminism. And this is something that interests me, and I think it's worth remembering. But you realize, of course, that the word cosmic, again, as Eva already said, in this case, has very little or nothing to do with the outer space, but rather refers to an effort to rewrite the human ancient history, and especially the emergence of spirituality in general and various religions, with women firmly placed in the center. So the main argument is that it was the women who started all religions, and the women who were first responsible for spirituality in human species. Kanapatska is certainly far from this interpretation, at least on the surface. We don't know what was really going on there. To be honest, her works produce in me a very divided and maybe conflicting impression, as always the case when you know the history, when you know the trajectory. And when I read several sources, and I learned that it's a kind of an interesting example of a sort of, white colonist fascinated with and attracted by the colonial space they inhabit, but in her case, of course, not voluntarily, we can say, or half so. As is known, there were actually many examples of Russian and then Soviet style writers and artists like that, like local Paul Gauguin's with the metropolitan artistic education, who were later mastering the colonial outskirts, we can say. And this is also one of such examples. But until now, the self-orientalizing indoctrination was and has been so powerful that they are very seldom seen through this critical decolonial lens. On the contrary, if you go to Dagestan, everybody will be very proud of her. For the sake of justice, of course, we have to say that many of these artists, including Kanapatsky, were quite good. They were quite talented, original, interesting. I mean, among my favorite examples that also belong to this sort of Soviet colonists in the outskirts of the empire is Ustomumin, Alexander Nikolaev in Uzbekistan, right? Just to name one. The Caucasus was also one of the favorite places for those lovers of exoticism and warm climate, who after Stalin's death, particularly, were not allowed to live in big cities, and following Brodsky's advice, ended up in distant provinces of the empire by the sea. And this was the story also behind Kanapatsky's moving to Dagestan. And in spite of this, dark, tragic connotations that are obviously there, it's still necessary to remember that all such artists with metropolitan academic art education and Russian or sufficiently Russified appearance, trajectory, name were always by default seen as superior to the local colonial artists. And that was originally their role with which they came there, even if they were politically suspicious. This was a result, of course, of the Soviet theatrical multiculturalism with the darkest unspoken ethnic national hierarchy at work. And this means that even if the artists themselves were far from any, Kulturjägers claims and didn't attempt to practice any civilizing missions, their role was already predefined, so to say, by the Soviet system as superior to any local artistic forms. And they were expected to channel this missionary syndrome, among other ways, through bringing the European or Russian, in this case, art principles to the outskirts of the empire, and at the same time join somehow the local group of, the singers of their motherland in creating all sorts of eulogies with a happy socialist present, but also with a colonial tint. So we must remember that any even mediocre artist from Moscow was automatically elevated to a very high position in the Soviet system when transferred to the colonial outskirts, particularly if this artist starts exploiting the exoticist topic. The usual, the predictable ways for these metropolitan figures setting down in the colonies were what? Exoticism and Orientalism. And Galina Kanapatsky was very successful in both, especially if we look at her other works. It's certainly a very specific kind of Orientalism that's worth mentioning. It's not aggressive, masculinist. It's not openly dehumanizing. It's not erotic, as many Russian Orientalist works were. On the contrary, she has managed to act as a friend, as an outsider who is genuinely in love and fascinated with the culture and people of Dagestan, and they loved her in return, also very honestly and genuinely. The main reason for the continuing blindness in this case and lack of criticism is, of course, the self-orientalizing tendency, which has been very pronounced in the Caucasus until very recently. But most of her work, I have to say this, of course, is not free from appropriation, simplification, trivialization, ornamental tendencies, decorative tendencies, and exploitation of stereotypes in the rendering of local environments, human and non-human alike. So she's indeed fascinated with Dagestan, but it remains somehow opaque for her. And the predictable pastoral and idyllic genre paintings focusing on, things like maternity or harvest, the beauty of the countryside, the national carnivals, and things like that, represent her fantasy of Dagestan rather than anything else. Perhaps I am too critical, but I see most of her colorful and no doubt very attractive and sympathetic works as rather, staying on the surface in the sense that they do not really connect with local cosmologies, cosmotechnics, ethics, visuality, problems, dramas, etc. These works are largely, they're not conventional, but they are opportunistic in the sense that they they go around these issues, but they are very, very skillfully made and interestingly made. What I mean is that Konopatskaya was not a bad artist at all. She was a good artist, and that she was aware of the latest aesthetic tendencies, styles, shifts, both internally and globally, which is very interesting, because living in the Soviet Union, it was hard to do. And as many other Soviet artists of the 1960s, was cautiously attempting to go back to the interrupted and banned for a very long time avant-garde. And modernist trajectories in the Soviet Union and beyond. So this art, I don't think that we can really call it socialist realism anymore, because socialist realism ended basically with the end of Stalin. And after that started very slow and cautious attempts to do something else. And one of these important trends from the 60s especially, and late 50s and 60s, was going back to the avant-garde and modernism that was abruptly banned or killed or destroyed or erased. So that's why, for example, Ekaterina Diogatyeva, I think, called this socialist modernism instead. So it's modernism, but still socialist, right? Konopatskaya is very eclectic. I was looking at many of her pictures and paintings, preparing and other works, and she's very eclectic in her influences, and even at times, I would say, postmodernist in the way she quotes from very well-known early 20th century works. For example, from Henri Matisse in her version of the dance. She has also a work Dance, which is very much kind of similar in composition. From the characteristic flattened perspective, also linked to her first education in graphics, I think, and specific coloristic decisions of many avant-garde works and from naive art, obviously. Since she worked as a theatrical artist, to me, some of her distorted perspectives actually remind of theatrical backdrops. And that also, adds to this impression of surreal, kind of surrealist it's not a real Dagestan. It's rather a theatrical kind of, composition or something that you can see on the stage. It's once again very attractive, very well made, but not maybe particularly original. One interesting element in her technique is a predominantly panoptic gaze, very modern, colonial, and very masculine also, that she uses in most of her genre works and becomes obvious and particularly disturbing in The Cosmic Mother. I will turn now. I'm sorry, what is that? Okay, so let me say a few words about The Cosmic Mother. It's a bit different from other works, of course, because it doesn't deal with Dagestan. It deals with a no less conventional for the 1960s topic in the USSR, that of conquering of the outer space, right? And again, as Eva already mentioned, in Russian, also cosmos, of course, comes from the Greek, and the word cosmos is more connected with the Greek origin and etymology, let's say, of the word, rather than the outer space, the way it's understood in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So it's already in the word, you see the esoteric origins rather than the modern colonial outer space. And it certainly had a very important flavor of the future that has finally come, the topic of the outer space, the cosmos in Russian, right? That has become present, something that is not promised anymore, but it's already here. So in some way, it was the closing of history. We finally reached to the point when history is over. A slow but persistent process of the cancellation of the future that so many left theorists were writing about started in the 60s in the Soviet Union, in contrast maybe with, for example, Western Europe, where it started a little bit later. And the outer space, I think, played a very important role in it. In my own Caucasus childhood, I remember this topic, this theme of the cosmos was everywhere, and it was very close from that place, from Dagestan, like a couple of 100 kilometers. So, for instance, there was ice cream parlor called Cosmos in the center of the city. And the best movie theater was called Vostok, the East, which is the name of the spaceship. All carried traces of this mass fascination with the outer space. So Konopatskaya again selected a very trendy topic and added an exotic ethnic and gender flavors to its reproducing the conventional Soviet woman in the outer space pattern, but with a twist, because it's not Valentina Tereshkova's portrait, quite the contrary. So that one of the well-known false Soviet myths, that of helping the downtrodden women of the East to emancipate and become true and equal builders of socialism, this is something that was very much promoted, is represented here literally in the face of this Dagestanian woman, the way Konopatskaya imagines Dagestanian women should look like in her other local color works. But in this case, this face is looking out of the spacesuit and holding a doll-like and equally space-suited baby. So the painting is very disturbing, I think, as it sends very contradictory impulses and messages. I will try to explain very quickly. First, the already mentioned panoptic gaze here as at its most extreme. We are looking at the woman with the baby and at the planet Earth in the background from an extremely detached, disembodied position. What this immediately evokes is, of course, the famous overview effect, grounded in the complete objectification of the Earth. Back in 1957, when a satellite circled around the Earth and took some pictures of the planet from the outer space, it was Hannah Arendt who commented on this in the opening pages of her famous work, The Human Condition, where she says that the immediate reaction was not pride in this tremendousness of human power and mastery, but a relief about the first step towards escape from man's imprisonment to the Earth, curiously repeating the words that were engraved on Tsiolkovsky's obelisk: mankind will not be bound to the Earth forever. So for Arendt, this was an incredible shift in looking at the Earth as a prison for human bodies that we need to liberate from, rather than a mother which gave life to all terrestrial creatures, including ourselves. This is a very crucial set of issues that I find strangely present in this painting, although maybe not obviously, right? So this famous first Earth photograph taken from the outer space is often given as an example of the deadly modern tendency to objectification, to seeing the Earth as a separate dead object, matter, disconnected with the modern subject. But this view can also trigger other interpretations. And this peculiar overview effect that many astronauts and cosmonauts wrote about is one forking path in the possible interpretations of human relations to the world. The Earth then starts to be seen in itself as a fragile, living, changing being, unprotected by anything from this enormous outer space, and as our mother and the only home we've ever had and we've ever knew. Then we have two mothers on Konopatskaya's work, the Mother Earth and the human mother. In decolonial interpretations of the image of the Earth from the outer space, it's usually seen as a final step in this consecutive objectification, but it's not the whole story, I would say. The view of the Earth from the outer space can be just as much the realization of one's connection to it and responsibility for it. And this unexpectedly brings us to multiple indigenous cosmologies that have had such holistic and homeostatic relational understandings of the planet as this fragile, dynamic entity with which the humans are in unstable balance for millennia. They didn't have to fly to the moon to realize that, while many astronauts did clearly that. They came to this worldview only via the epiphany of the overview effect. And I'm telling you, reminding you this story because I see some of these tensions in this really strange painting. On the surface, it resembles an icon, as many of you mentioned already, or perhaps a circularized version of it that was so much popular in the Soviet iconography, from Max Panson with his Uzbek Madonna to the Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. And we have, I think, his icon, you can show it. So Alexei Leonov made an icon. He was also an artist himself and was a true believer also And among his many paintings, he also produced several icons. And this one is very strange and very much resembles the composition and setting of Konopatska's work. He said early on in an interview that a priest asked him to make an icon in which Mary is not depicted against the mundane earthly landscape, but rather against the universe, as if from the outer space. In Konopatska's case, there is a contrast between the conventional posture of this woman holding a baby and her gaze. Look at her eyes. She has a completely vacant gaze. The face of Konopatska, mother, does not just resemble Dagestanian women from her genre paintings. In fact, she's a bit different. Her face is sad, pensive, haggard, even brooding, while terrestrial Dagestanian mothers in her other works are usually happy, smiling, plump, rosy cheek, you know. Her relation to the baby is also unclear to me in this picture. In contrast with most icons, she's looking straight at the viewer. She's not looking straight at the viewer. And in contrast with most, let's say, Renaissance Madonnas, except perhaps Raphael's tragic face, Sistine Madonna, this one is not looking at the baby either. So not looking at the baby, not looking at the viewer. Her gaze is somehow inward, detached, perhaps contemplating the situation she's got into. And for me, one of the possible reasons for this sadness and perhaps a bad premonition of the future to come is precisely this wrong path that humanity has taken, cutting the links with the Mother Earth, completely alienating ourselves from the world and ultimately from ourselves as well. So the mother and the child in spacesuits are not, in fact, a celebration of triumphant technologies and human power, but rather a nightmare of the future to come, where we will have no home, or will be unable to return there because it becomes unlivable, let's say. So for me, this painting has a sort of premonition of the coming age of unsettlement that we inhabit today, the age of millions of refugees, what is referred to as the Anthropocene, and who knows, maybe the age of the human exiled from the earth as a planet, right? That they first made unlivable and imagined as an object instead of seeing it as our mother and a source of life. So to some extent, I can feel these only emerging maybe concerns and global threats and challenges in this Konopatska's quite interesting and unusual work. As I said, it falls out of most of her other works that are connected with Dagestan. Okay, I will stop here because I don't want to take too much time also.
Thank you for those brilliant thoughts, Eva and Madina. I'm frantically writing down strands from the orientalizing gaze to the idea of weak resistance as a form of strength, to this beautiful articulation of the interior versus the exterior world, the colonization of space and territorial colonization when it comes to planet Earth, of course. The cosmic and the cosmological, and the notion of the semi-periphery. And given that Madina just spoke now, that there has been a question that that has kind of been reluctantly floating around in my mind. And I think I was reluctant to ask, but given the content of what you said, it seems important to ask, and it's a question to both of you. I think there's a very fraught and ambivalent dimension to both the practices that you've spoken about in relation to this idea of whether it's exploitation or appropriation, because from the perspective of Janina Krapos-Świderska, she's also engaging with these ideas of Zen Buddhism and engaging with Tantra in a way that, at least to me, seems to position a kind of wisdom and knowledge somewhere further east. Madina, of course, you've spoken about the dynamics of Galina Konopatska as a Ukrainian artist coming to Dagestan within the space of the Soviet Union as a space of empire. So my question, I think, to you both is really how we might, and it kind of jumps off, I think, this very much this idea of the semi-periphery or the second world that comes up in both your works and research, which is how might we think about the work of both these artists without necessarily reducing them to Western ideas of cultural appropriation and keeping the specificity of where they're positioned, without critiquing them in the same way as we would critique Western artists, but at the same time without keeping them in the position of the victim, right? And I think in a way that opens up to this bigger question of what is the specificity of the imperial and colonial dynamic of that space. And when we think about this idea of resistance, of course, I'm piling up questions onto questions, but that's fine. Feel free to pick up whichever part you prefer. But then there's this bigger question of what is the specificity of the work that you do from the perspective of decolonial feminism and feminist anti-fascism from this position of, let's say, the semi-periphery.
So if I may, I'm going to start because you mentioned anti-fascism by the end of all those questions. So, so I think this is a good starting point and a very relevant one. So I'd like to mention also the borderlands and the Chicana feminism that we sort of mentioned in our discussion before this panel, while preparing to this panel, and which somehow I forgot to mention this time, although I spoke too long. So such authors as Gloria Anzaldúa, Cherry Moraga, Maria Lugones, and other amazing feminist, Chicana feminist writers emphasize the fact that it's not necessarily that humans cross the borders, but also borders cross them. That living in the borderlands means to have the lived experience of hybridity and contradictions on every level of the lived experience. And I believe that this notion of contradictions and this notion of métissage, of the constant hybridization that comes, well, this is something that I actually once explained to some sort of very important commission. They were, very happy sociologists. It's a very disturbing view for me, happy sociologists. I mean, if you are looking into society, you probably shouldn't be that happy, but anyway, so these very happy sociologists were emphasizing how amazing it is to see this beauty of multiculturalism. And they were really strongly advocating this kind of crappiest mainstream understanding of multitude and multiplicity that you can ever imagine, erasing it from the actual experience of emancipation, of struggle, of resistance, exploitation, etc., etc. So after hearing like 15 minutes of this, I was like, okay, but this comes with pain. It's like, Karl Marx wrote in The Capital that the dispossession is burned in the living skin of the dispossessed. This is how, so this is the images of Toni Morrison's accounts of slavery, for instance, where there is this mother who slaps her daughter because she does not feel empowered or capable to explain what slavery kind of tattoo or burned mark actually means, etc., etc. So these images we need to have in our head, and I believe that both of our artists somehow also have those lived experience or second-hand lived experience of traumas coming from the Second World War and all these brutal intrusions of historical conflicts, etc. So I believe that this sort of that their resort to other knowledges, which fortunately and unfortunately combine, on one hand, the openness to marginalized knowledges, on the other hand, this kind of, in some way, colonial attitude of appropriation, that they differ very much in themselves from what a Western, let's say, male white artist would do while appropriating, I don't know, colonial cultures, colonized, cultures, artifacts, etc. So there is this difference. And there is this ambivalence and contradiction at the core of this practice. And I'm very happy that you actually somehow warn us not to take for granted the sort of innocence of the practices of the artists that we are discussing. both of you, Madina, you mentioned this, and Dina, you also signalized it in your question that these artists are not innocent. So that's obvious. But then if we look at cyberfeminism, if we look at Chicana feminism, neither Gloria Anzaldúa nor Donna Haraway would speak of their cyberfeminism or Chicana feminism in terms of cleanness, innocence, etc. Haraway emphasizes very strongly that the origins of the cyborg are not innocent, are far from innocence even. Also, also Anzaldúa's work on Chicana feminism is very much about how her own heritage is both the colonized and the colonizing. This is also something that Poland has to play with a lot. As a country which used to be a sort of empire back in 17th century, it was actually the largest country, maybe in Europe, even if you look at the map very carefully. So therefore, it was a very strong colonizer, and yet later it disappeared from the map for 120 years, right? So if you look at the map of 19th century Europe, you will not find Poland. You will find Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Prussian kingdom. So therefore, this ambivalence, so I believe that I would suggest that we ironically use the notion of national heritage to speak about Janina Kraupe-Świderska as precisely somebody who is performing something very Polish by being, on one hand, the kind of sort of colonizer, but also somebody who is colonized as a minoritarian country kind of artist, but also as a woman in a super male-dominated art scene. So this is something that we are only now discussing, how post-war artist scene was actually more sexist, I would say, and more exclusive towards women than between the two World War art scene. So this is another topic that probably is expanding our questions even further. But yeah, so this would be my response somehow. The contradictions of the lived life as a perspective in which the practices of colonizing, being colonized, being colonized, etc., they can be understood as something slightly different than this artificial kind of appropriation which is made in the context of the West. Okay, thank you so much. I'll pass it on.
Thank you. Thank you. As always, lots of things to reflect on and connect to. Well, I was thinking that from the colonial perspective, what is at work here we would call imperial difference. There is a term that we coined many years ago and we've been using since then. And in case of Russia, I mean, Tsarist Russia and later Soviet Union, because it's just kind of, followed in many ways to what was there before and haven't even changed some tactics and politics, or only on the surface ideologically. But in that sense, we can say that, yes, it was a genus-based empire. It was an empire/colony in the sense that it had an inferiority complex. And even if it was the largest territorially empire in the beginning of the 20th century, larger than the British Empire, for example. But of course, nobody considered Russian Empire in that sense because it was second-rate to anything. And in modernity, it was always second-rate and always doing something that Eva described, like trying to catch up, to be accepted into the Western kind of, league of empires and never succeeding. And that's why you see this crazy behavior from nationalism and from trying to reject the West when it's not accepting us. So, so it's a very, very clear case of this imperial difference. But what we have in the outskirts of empire, like Dagestan or like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or something like that, it's even more serious and complicated in the sense that it's a colonial difference of the imperial difference. So all of this, discriminations, all of these distortions, they come in layers and they leak into each other also in very complex ways. And that's why, of course, we cannot use this kind of binary thinking like colonizer, colonized, or, who is in the power. Nobody is in a power position there constantly, no. And of course, it was a more complex interplay, especially I'm familiar very well with what was going on in the Caucasus republics, and I can tell you, there were roles, there were certain kind of, prescribed positionalities. If you wanted to make a career as a national writer or artist, you also had to follow a very prescribed trajectory. then you were not allowed to be an avant-gardist or modernist, of course, because there was a canon for those artists also. But you also had to do certain things, and you were not allowed to be a postmodernist as a writer. You know, you had to be a singer of your native land, so to say, in a very simplified way. And in that case, of course, there was this kind of hierarchy between those who belonged, so to say, to the metropolitan/Russian and indirectly European also, of course, because it was as a kind of a copy, a bad copy of European art anyway, or sometimes a good copy, but anyway, it was not original. And that is important to keep in mind. And I'm not trying to say that, of course, there was a colonizer. Then nobody was. I mean, read, for example, Camus. Like Albert Camus was also an example of that, because he was French, living in the French colonies in the Africa, but he was from a very poor family. And so he never belonged anywhere. You know, the local society rejected him, but of course, the French society as well. And so he always felt this. And I think that was true also about many so-called dissidents or people who had to you know, leave the metropolis and go to these kind of faraway places. But what I wanted to say is that, yes, as Eva mentioned, there are these disgusting official forms of multiculturalism and this kind of things that we all dislike so much because they're so fake. But there was also something else going on there that is not, we have to remember, especially in places like Dagestan, which is in itself has like more than 100 languages. In every second village, you have a new language, you know. And so it's not a homogeneous place to begin with. But then there's so many people coming from all over the whole this Russia, let's say, in the Soviet Union, like Kanapaska, and many other examples I can give you. And so as a result, there was, at least for several decades, a very interesting transcultural society, you know, and it was not made artificially or top down. No, it was actually developing by itself, you know, through the people, through connections, through what they were doing. There were a lot of things done in the Caucasus. I remember it very well, underground place with music, with theater, with literature, you know, and I know I'm aware of such things also in Central Asia and in Siberia and other places. So all of that was not only prescribed by internationalism or from the Soviet government or from the Communist Party, no. And that is also something that is very drastically changing today. And the new societies that are coming are, of course, quite different, and sometimes so it's also artificially homogenized. So absolutely, we have to question these kind of tags that are put very often on artists. And it's interesting, I was also thinking about contemporary artists. For example, if we think of Taus Makhacheva, like a Dagestani artist coming from a very important, you know, kind of history and trajectory of her family and her famous grandfather, Rasul Gamzatov, and the whole family was like that. But I sometimes read this about Taus, like she is appropriating her own culture. You know, like it's some kind of a very convenient way of accusing the artist, no matter how close they are to their own cultures, if they belong or not. I don't think it's a very productive way of working with art. You know, if we start with this and say, okay, who is pure, who is clean of this? We are all always unclean and indeed hybrid and creolized. So this is not the question to ask about art. But at the same time, of course, we have to know how these trajectories were artificially constructed very often in Soviet years, and how, you know, there were canonized figures that were not actually how we know them and what we think about them and what was written in official sources. So it's very important to be working with this kind of materials and rethink them today from different perspectives that maybe were not present before or not allowed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those incredibly generous responses. there are a few words that are hovering in my mind. I think opacity was mentioned, the idea of the underground. And I'm at the same time dwelling with your very evocative descriptions of the two bodies of paintings, or the two practices of Konopatska and Kraupa-Świderska. And there's something very interesting, I think, going on in the way that you've described both practices. I think with Kraupa-Świderska, it seems like there's a kind of very generous exteriorizing of a very personal interior world that's going on. And yet at the same time, I would posit that it remains largely illegible. Like, I think these paintings are very difficult to somehow, as it were, make sense of. I'm kind of looking over at Daria, hoping she's nodding. And at the same time, I think there's this moment in your presentation, Madina, where you spoke, I wrote it down, I'm just going to try and find it, where you spoke about the idea that Konopatska somehow is on the surface, that she cannot access those indigenous Dagestani cosmologies that are there, but yet the work is somehow not engaging with this. And I'm curious about this kind of latency that you're both alluding to. There's a kind of exteriorization, and yet there's a kind of latency. And I wonder actually about this as a model for the way that we approach something that you ever had said, that the modes of knowledge, or the modes of knowledges, I suppose, that Kraupa-Świderska was working with, i.e. referring to spirituality, were secondary and excluded. And when I think about this from my own research, as I say, the space of what I might in scare quotes call Eurasia, and the history of what's actually going on in the Soviet Union in relation to this question of spirituality and religion, it becomes very, very manifest that the official line is not necessarily what's going on in more, let's say, private or latent narratives. And where I'm going with this has nothing to do with the idea of the kind of public and private, the official and unofficial. I find those binaries incredibly unsatisfying. But I wonder about these kind of silences or opacities that may remain inaccessible and may wish to remain inaccessible, may wish to stay within certain communities, just like some of those indigenous cosmologies that you referred to, Madina, that Galina did not have access to with her work. And I wonder what we as researchers, thinkers do with that acknowledgement, how to work with the acknowledgement of some of those silences, nonetheless knowing that they somehow exist without resorting to externalizing something. I think about, Madina, you've edited a book that has opacities in its title, co-edited a book that includes the word opacities in its title, and I think you're very well placed to speak to this. But also, Eva, I remember this incident that you referred to, a kind of a long-term incident of the parties you organized under a bridge in Warsaw, and the way that subsequently there was this moment of kind of institutionalizing them within these exhibitions of underground cultures that then were surfaced, right? And if there is another mode to go about working with some of these, let's say, underground, private, interior modes of knowledge, living, what might we resort to work with them that doesn't rely on this kind of externalization?
I'm tempted to speak. I will try to be very short, but also I would like to invite everyone to ask questions or to make comments. Probably, but if you write the question or the comment in the chat, then we can ask you to discuss it vocally, if you like. So this is to anyone here. And thank you for the question, obviously. I was thinking of the cryptic, of the notion of opacity, but also of the cryptic of algorithms, of music, mathematics, that were a vital reference to Janina Kraupe. And in there, obviously, there is a huge element of professional knowledge of music, for instance, that permeates her work. But also I was thinking of Walter Benjamin and his notion of translation and the task of translator and the untranslatability of certain experiences, of certain words, or even entire languages. And from that perspective, and this is not a sort of rejection of your question, but it's also my curiosity of what Madina has to say on the topic of opacity. So I try to be very brief. And so Benjamin speaks of translation in terms of a process that should be proceeding lovingly. And it's very interesting for two reasons. First of all, love is always interesting, but secondly, Benjamin never wrote about love, really. He's not, also Spivak never wrote about love. And in the theory of translation that she produced, she also mentions this necessity to proceed lovingly. So this is interesting how two very critical thinkers suddenly resort to love when they speak about translation and intranslatability. So there is, I believe, a certain sort of affective core at the work of Janina Kraupe, in the work of translation as well, that sort of proceeds with opacity in ways that are beyond the binary. I would suggest that sort of strategy. So beyond the private public, but also beyond the comprehensible, incomprehensible, and also beyond the knowledge, not knowledge, because what is cryptic can also be inspired by both, by certain forms of knowledge, but also by certain forms of improvisation or kind of simulation of using certain codes. And I believe that in the mystical practices that Janina Kraupe's work engages with, this sort of uses of very cryptic, very complex knowledges can be seen as both, as improvisation and as highly professional kind of reference. So that would be my response. And Madina, if you want to take over, please do.
Thank you, Eva. Yeah, of course, for me, opacity is important, and I've been working with this concept for many years since I've read Edouard Glissant, because he was the first poet and philosopher who introduced it into a critical context, you know, as an important anti-colonial concept, I would say. And he literally says that we have the right to opacity. Colonial cultures don't have to be transparent. They don't have to sit there and be happy to be, you know, understood and interpreted. They have the right to stay opaque. And I think it's true about Caucasus cultures, and particularly about Dagestanian culture also. But what we deal with here in the works of Kanabatska, it's, as I said, I mean, I can only say again that it's not Dagestan to me, it's her vision of Dagestan, which is nothing wrong with that. I mean, all artists do that, right? They don't make photographic depictions, they give us their interpretation. And her interpretation is very attractive, of course, and is friendly. It's a sort of modernist Orientalism of a sort, you know, but at the same time, I was thinking, like, what does it take for, you know, our framework to shift to be more interested, for example, in what Dagestanian artists do or have to say. Still, I mean, there is no clear division. And very often when some of these works are shown and in exhibitions abroad, especially in Europe, you don't find many, you know, local indigenous Dagestanian artists who would be representing their republic or, you know, even be shown. So that is also an interesting and alarming side. And I think partly it's because there is this thing, as you all know better than me, as an international market of art and certain kind of, you know, established canons of looking at art. And I remember when I was first discussing this sort of thing and showing some of these artists that were not known in Europe, I was giving maybe 20 years ago a talk in Vienna, and people were very condescending. They just look at this and immediately put a tag on it. And they said, this is ethnic art, you know, and that's it explains a lot. Like for this, into this tag, they would include both Kanapadskaya and any indigenous artists that we could find in Dagestan. They won't see the nuances. They won't see, you know, these trajectories hidden maybe and struggles of how Dagestani artists, you know, became, let's say, professional, as it's called usually, right, and got this kind of academic education, but still had connections with the indigenous roots and the ways art was practiced. And of course, condescendingly called skill in Soviet years, right? Because very often they were called artisans rather than artists, although of course it's a very questionable binary also. And then only I think in the 70s or 80s in Dagestan, you see the local indigenous artists who are actually doing, for example, oil painting or some other forms that are more kind of traditional for the canon. But they're doing it in a very interesting and original ways. And Kanapadskaya is way before that. I mean, she comes at the point when there is almost no local artists, or these local artists are kept in very narrow, limited frames. And they are only allowed to do something local color style, or maybe, yes, belated socialist realism or something like that, you know. And so in that sense, maybe I was thinking, you know, maybe she was allowed actually more freedom than the local artists who would try to, you know, desperately be like European or like Russian artists and practice the art that did not exist in Dagestan before. It was imposed on it together with Russian/Soviet modernity. I mean, it's a very complicated thing. And I was also thinking about the book that you mentioned, Dina. We have a very interesting author in this collection on the dialogues of post-colonial, post-socialist feminisms, whose name is Riley Marling. She's an Estonian feminist, and her article is actually about opacity as a feminist technique. And she says that sometimes it's better to stay opaque and invisible and maybe not very powerful, but free. And as soon as you become part of the institution, as you you deal with certain policies and you become visible, you are not free anymore. And we know very well that it's true. And it's actually a choice that many artists have to make, and many curators have to make, and all of us, and of course scholars as well. So I am totally for it. I'm for the right to be opaque and to stay opaque and not show everything to the world. So yes, I like that.
Thank you so much. I look forward to quizzing you on how you might also be practicing opacity as a thinker at some point, but I see there's a question in the chat that I wonder if Misha Yakovlev wants to ask the question, or I can read it out. If somebody can explain to me how to unmute people if they wish to.
I think people can just choose to unmute themselves, it's fine.
Okay, great. Sure. So, two questions. If we think about a colonized body being subjected to and mediated through the white colonial gaze, even when the creator or subject of the gaze is themselves colonized, as a Ukrainian artist in Dagestan would have been, wouldn't the violence of colonial mediation be only amplified by the colonial culture's self-victimizing insistence on its secondary modernity? I will read, maybe I'll read the second one out in a moment and let you dwell on this for now. And I think this might be more to Madina, I suppose, if we're talking about Ukraine.
Yeah, that's what exactly what I thought. So that's why I was silent.
So do you want me to answer, or would you like to read more questions?
I'm happy to read more.
Okay.
So the second question is, Daria mentioned how the colonial Soviet Russian modernity was somehow secondary to a Western one. Wouldn't you say that this is a dangerous and ultimately unhelpful binarization, both due to the existence of less successful colonial projects in the West, for example, Italian futurism, and due to the fact the materiality of colonialism and its cultural mediations being largely in the same being largely the same in Russia, the USSR, America, Britain, etc. Residential schools as a tool for destruction of indigenous cultures and the art arising from the Great Game come to mind. Madina, do you want to have a go?
I mean, I can start, yes. Well, I was trying to be more neutral in my discussion of this artist, although I tend to agree with this interpretation in this question, because I'm myself an indigenous woman from the Caucasus. So I know very well how it feels when somebody maybe colonized in their own metropolitan space comes to this colonial space and start behaving in this typical manner, you know, like bringing enlightenment and emancipating us. And of course, I mean, I was lucky I was born late, so it wasn't that obvious at that point already, because there was already a local intelligentsia sort of, you know, taking positions and all that in the 70s when I was growing up. But at the same time, I've read a lot of archival material, writing one of my books on, you know, in feminism and, you know, in the feminist movements, also in the Caucasus and Central Asia. And so I know how it all worked. Fortunately, it's not exactly the case of this artist, because she was not one of those, you know, early feminists sent from Moscow to the Caucasus to bring a Soviet regime and help women to emancipate. No, her trajectory was tragic in her own right, because her husband was imprisoned after World War II because he was on the occupied territory and he was captured by the Nazis. And so when he returned, he was sent to prison. And after that, they were both not allowed to live in Leningrad or Moscow. And that's why they chose to go to Pakistan. But at the same time, I was just imagining, you know, like how would local women feel when they saw themselves depicted in this happy, pretty Orientalist pictures, for instance, you know, and how did it connect or did not connect with their reality and the kinds of lives they had and the kinds of issues they had to deal with. And we know that even until now, this sort of colonialist attitudes and the stereotypes are very much still there. I mean, even if you go in Moscow today and you speak, people will still try to stereotype you as a poor woman of the Caucasus who doesn't have the right to open her mouth and say anything. That's what I've experienced even 10 years ago. You know? So I would say that, yes, I would agree with this interpretation, although it doesn't have to be the only one. I mean, it doesn't have to be so radical. We can also be maybe more understanding, let's say, and inclusive. Yeah.
If I may add something to that, I think that there is this issue of those invisible regions also that sort of complexifies, no, we cannot say that, but complicates any analysis of the cultural artistic practices, especially if there are layers to that. So basically the opacity and untranslatability come in handy as notions of resistance to the binary codes that the author of the question and also most of us try to revisit or revise or even avoid. So the binary codes and the segregations into first, third, second world, for instance, all this vocabulary is on one hand the one that we are contesting and undermining and subverting, but then on the other hand, this is the vocabulary that allows any expression of the inequalities. Let's think of projects of universality or globalism that do not make those distinctions. Let's think of the inequalities and colonial narratives disappearing from, let's say, a discussion of the public sphere that seems to be globalized and therefore neglects any differences and conflicts and exploitative historical practices. So I believe that if I were to answer the question of Michał Yakovlev, I would say that obviously it's complicated, but also there are elements of the notion of, let's say, secondary modernity that can be useful. So there is we spoke earlier on about this lack of innocence, and I believe that the language that we are, I think that the more complexity of a situation we approach, the more controversial our language will seem to be, basically. So there is this temptation to remain silent and to allow sort of bare facts and bare bodies to speak, which is something that Gayatri Spivak was warning against as another version of coloniality. So, so the categories we have been made in the most controversial part of the world, obviously, the most colonizing and oppressive and white dominated, etc. But these are the tools that, you know, our work is engaging with and has been shaped by, and we need to negotiate them. But this kind of easy rejection of, okay, I'm not going to use this word or that word, does not actually push the decolonization process forward that much as it would if we negotiated it with more care. So that would, I think, be my response here.
Thank you so much. And I wonder if there are any last questions before we try to wrap up. Maybe the eminent PPV colleagues gathered in their parallel space.
I don't know. I mean, I think there was such a rich conversation and so many themes were touched upon that it feels kind of, it would feel indulgent to zoom in on any one now, especially that it's already, we're already past the end of the meeting time. I suppose maybe we can just reflect on how, after the meeting, we can reflect on how we can make use of some of these themes and some of these ideas, and perhaps some of the complicated and highly problematic aesthetics and configurations that we discussed today, how we can apply them to our
Contemporary context.
and how we can mutate them in our contemporary context. And pervert them. So a note of an encouragement to perversion is all that we have to provide. And
indeed, we are at our roughly 90, just over 90 minutes actually. So the only thing that remains is to say a huge thank you to Madina and Eva for those brilliant thoughts that I think are providing incredible momentum for why there is so much still to be done on a continual basis, of course. And at least I am leaving this conversation with actually a really real sense of being energized. I hope you have been too. And thank you so much for being here and joining us for the conversation. And I don't know if PPV have any other subsequent events that they want to flag, but I should just say, if you happen to be in London, and of course it's wonderful if you're joining remotely from a totally different place, but the exhibition continues until the end of Saturday, the 22nd. Please come along and see it.
Yes, and I just also would like to encourage everyone to go to see the show, which is really great, and especially now that we've heard such extraordinarily rich analyses of these works, to have a look at them, and if you liked, even if you've already been. There are some more PPV events in the works. The next event date yet to be confirmed will be a very belated launch for a book of Russian feminist, a tiny book of Russian feminist poetry called F, published by the Isolari publishing house, edited by Galina Rimbu, who's a Lviv-based poet, and there will be some creative responses to the poems gathered in that book by Galina, hopefully, by Nika Dubrovsky, and by James Messiah, who's a London-based poet. And that will be advertised soon, and hopefully towards the end of February. In person, I think, yeah.
Great.
So I hope to see you there. Look at ppv.life for more information. And yeah, thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. It's been so
That's right.
brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you so much.